Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event, which is the last of our main sessions in the Knowledge Asymmetries in the Age of Machine Learning Symposium, which addresses the relationship between governance, participation, and technological knowledge in the world today. This symposium is organized by the Writing Machine Collective, a Hong Kong-based group of media artists founded by Linda Lai. I'm Héctor Rodriguez, and I'm also a member of this collective. The topic of today's particular talk has to do with the black box. And this is a topic of great concern to many of us who are media artists, because perhaps for the first time in the history of media art, or in the history of world art, artists have to use technologies that are black boxes, technologies that we don't understand. And this symposium will give us a chance to reflect on the implications of this condition. Today, we are really honored to have a very distinguished speaker. Professor Frank Pasquale is an expert in legal issues related to artificial intelligence, algorithms, and machine learning. He is professor of law at the Brooklyn Law School, a visiting scholar at the AI Now Institute, an affiliate fellow at Yale University's Information Society Project, and a member of the American Law Institute. He is also co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Cross-Disciplinary Research in Computational Law, based in the Netherlands, and a member of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence in Automated Decision-Making and Society. His landmark book, The Black Box Society, The Secret Algorithms That Control Money and Information, has been recognized as a key study on the law and political economy of information. His book, New Laws of Robotics, Defending Human Expertise in the Age of AI, rethinks the political economy of automation, promoting human capacities as an irreplaceable center in an inclusive economy. The order of today's program is that Professor Pasquale will give his talk in the beginning, and after that we will have time for questions and answers. Please note that we are recording this symposium for archival purposes. If you don't wish to be recorded during the question and answer session, you're welcome to stay muted and type your questions in the chat box. Audiences who might prefer to interact directly with the speaker are welcome to alert the administrator by sending a message through the chat box. This is the last of the main talks in this symposium, but please stay tuned because we are planning to organize a series of discussion sessions related to the topics of this symposium. We will send information to all of you soon. Without further ado, I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to our speaker today and welcome our speaker. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Héctor. It is really an honor to be here, and I found the past work of the Writing Machines Collective fascinating, and I'm a big fan of contemporary art, and and I will try to work in a few references in my talk. I was just visiting some Chelsea galleries here in New York the other day and found some good examples of these black boxes being used by Janet Cardiff and George Burris Miller in some of their work. And so I'll be focusing a bit more today on the law and policy side. So I'll start sharing my screen. Let me see if I can accomplish this transition somewhat seamlessly. Where can it be? Oh yeah, I should just share the screen. Okay. I'll try sharing Safari first, and then I'll. Okay, and then I will do our Control Command F to show the whole screen, and let's see. Let's see if perhaps I can view this as a slideshow. There we go. Okay. So the title for today's talk is on playing with or being played by the black box, the subjective experience of self-presentation for algorithmic audiences. I kind of wish that I just called the talk "The Dark Side of Gamification," because that's really the theme of today. The theme of today is that in confronting black box algorithms and AI, many times we are called upon or feel like we should try to play with them to see what sort of stimulus from us leads to a desired response, right? And I think that in the case of these black boxes, sometimes that can be an emancipatory move, but I also worry sometimes that that can lead one to be played by the black box. And there's some fascinating work by people like Jaron Lanier in "You Are Not a Gadget" that I think is inspiring of some of this on the computer science side. On the privacy law side, there's a worry about modulation. On the social theory side, there's Bogard's book, The Simulation of Surveillance, and Phil Ager's warnings about surveillance as a form of capture and promoting individuals to act in certain ways. So we have all these sort of deep theoretical foundations, but for today, what I want to try to do is give some really concrete examples of what this feels like to be played by the black box, and how we might develop some alternative strategies aside from trying to play with black boxes to develop a sense of agency and control in the face of them. So in The Rise of the Black Box is a interesting concept, right? Scholars in law, computer science, and social science have critiqued the rise of black box AI. The idea behind the critique is that it can produce results and judgments that are too complex to be explained in standard narrative forms or even scientific notation, right? So I would say there's two levels of critique there, right? There's the first is the idea that for a judgment to be valid, that it ought to be explainable, that one should explain it to another person. The second is a critique coming from within computer science by people like Judea Pearl, looking at causation, saying that we really need to understand how the AI is working before we can deem it a science. That if we have AI that is generating results, even if the results are relatively good, we still should be suspicious of it until we have a clearer sense of exactly how the causal mechanisms work. And this critique has come out in areas ranging from medical AI to predictive policing. For example, with medical AI, you can have black box AI that can predict over a certain data set very well, but then you add different people to the data set and it doesn't predict very well, right? So that's a concern about effectiveness. The concern about narrative, on the other hand, I think is more a concern about popular control, democratic understanding. It's more of a normative critique there. So I think there's both engineering and normative critiques of black box AI. But we also are running into a situation where sometimes transparency is impossible for the reasons I give in the Black Box Society book, right? And that transparency can be impossible either because the system really does need to be incredibly complex to operate, or it could be because there's a problem in terms of trade secrets that the law prevents the sharing of the information. And so when transparency is impossible, how can the system be legitimate? Well, one emerging answer is to permit the public at large to play with the system, to test what happens when different inputs are entered, right? So you can sort of have a system out there. You can see what happens if I change my response slightly. And to give a concrete example of this, this is an example. I'll start with explainable algorithmic systems and then move to unexplainable ones. So this is an explainable algorithmic system for emigration to Canada. And I thought it was a fascinating example because, after the 2016 election in the US, lots of my friends, were saying, how do we move from New York to Canada, right? They was kind of scared of being around President Trump, right? And so the idea became, there's a great deal of interest in like, well, how does Canada decide? And in general, at least for Americans, the chief thing is there are several different factors. Education is an important factor in some ways, and then that has different sub-factors. You can get up to 25 points. I imagine that a AI machine learning expert that had a PhD in machine learning, et cetera, would probably have 25 points. And I don't know who gets how lawyers fit into that scheme because I didn't look into it too deeply. Then ability in English and or French. Given the nature of the Canadian polity, there's a lot of emphasis on knowing both French and English. That really advances one's candidacy if you can say that you not only know English, but that you can be part of a polity where you can go to Quebec and other areas and be able to speak French fluently. Experience is another one. Age, arranged employment in Canada, and adaptability. And so in playing with this algorithmic system, one of the things that I tried to figure out was how old at what point, if I wanted to move to Canada, would I have to learn French, right? This is an interesting thing to me because I've tried to learn French earlier. I can read French somewhat, but the speaking eluded me when I tried to learn it back in college summer school. So this is helpful, right? It's a scoring system, but it's a scoring system that allows people to develop some sense of agency where they can say, all right, if I have a college degree, I have certain experience, I have arranged employment. It may be that if I try to move now, I don't need to know French, but if I try to move when I'm in my 50s, I do, right? And so this, I think, is a really interesting example of algorithmic systems being open to individuals to try to understand, like, how is the system judging you, and what can you do to be judged better? Now, I want to contrast this with something like algorithmic scoring of videos by a candidate applying for a job. All right, so this is a example. I think someone took a screenshot off of one firm called HireVue, which has been in the news in the US in terms of its doing video screenings for candidates. And the idea here is that you may be a candidate for a job, say someone is applying to be a barista at Starbucks. And Starbucks may get thousands of applications or tens of thousands of applications to be a barista, right? Walmart, you can think of any giant firm. They may get many, many applications for this. And let me say, it feels like a waste to us to try to have people interview these thousands of applicants. And so why not have a machine learning algorithm that can try to assess who would be the best worker at the coffee store, right? So one way of doing this, and of course, I believe that with respect to these firms, I'm not exactly sure with respect to HireVue, but certainly there are firms out there that would have secret modes of evaluating the person. So the question might be, there might be variables within the system that are either coded against videos of successful candidates in the past, or that might include just generally things that are helpful. So for example, someone that smiles a lot, that the system could be coded to give you more points if you smiled, right? If you could smile at the beginning of each question, right? Here, the question the person is asked is, describe a situation in which you effectively used your reasoning skills to handle something new or unfamiliar. And you can decide whether you want to smile and say that this was a really sort of take an attitude of wry distance from your past experience and sort of relate it in this way that embodies a tone of warmth and openness. Or you might say, I want to be really serious, and I want to, think back to this time when my team was in crisis, and we had this way in which we tried to understand the problem in a new way, and I was able to do much better in that way, right? And I think that this question of, recording, what I want to ask here is this a situation where we should, from a policy level or even from a normative level, want the firms that are out there doing these video job interviews to put their software on and to give people points, sort of a preliminary scoring of how they would have done on the interview? Or is it something where that is seen as less as an emancipatory move, as something that's really liberating people, and more as one more way in which people are trying to train themselves to interact with machines? And to come back to my example of speaking French, which I think is really a really interesting contrast here, recall that with respect to the Canadian example, I was concerned about when one would have to learn French. This may well be thought of as trying to learn the language of the hiring algorithm, right? What does the hiring algorithm want? Does it want people to have particularly expressive faces? Does it want people to have relatively reserved faces? Does it want people that speak very fast because they want to show exactly how excited they are about the job? Or does it want people who like to speak slowly and to know that they are clearly understood as they are speaking, right? And so there's a million different ways, and I haven't even gotten into content yet, right? I haven't even said anything about what type of experience might score you high on this and what type of experience might score you low. I've just been talking about self-presentation as styles of, or the aesthetics of self-presentation, tone of voice, expressions, etc. But substance could be even more important here, right? They may be, because imagine if you're interviewing for a coffee cafe, they may really want to hear the story of when you figured out how to make ginger ale out of Sprite and Coke. That's a legend that you can make ginger ale out of Sprite and Coke, or something with beverages, or not. They might want someone who's been in other experiences. So this is the question, and I'm going to use the rest of the talk to think through how either direction is actually problematic. How either, if the software we're dealing with, if it's a complete black box and it's just secret, and you just come on and you have no idea, and the criteria are constantly changing, that is a scenario, I think, of powerlessness that I think is quite troubling. Whereas on the other side, if you're presented with the opportunity to be continually interacting with the machine to figure out how one could be hired with new hiring algorithms, that has its own problems of modulation, of what Bogard and Agar call capture, or I think Bogard, actually, William Bogard in Simulation of Surveillance calls it modulation, and that this should also be questioned, right? So to move on with this, why is this an interesting topic? Well, this is a part of a presentation given by Arvind Narayanan. I'm actually going to be in dialogue with him in January on this topic at a conference at NYU Law School. The Public Interest Technology Group there is working in these areas. And what Narayanan, a computer scientist, has noticed is that there are different levels of accuracy and aspiration in AI and machine learning, right? And what Narayanan says that is that with perception, there's genuine rapid progress in things like Shazam for identifying a song. And I've been amazed at how often Shazam can identify a song for me, and the ability of algorithmic encoding of song information to lead to classification has been a major success there. Reverse image search, there's very great advances there, sometimes deeply worrisome because we have the problem of being entirely known by our faces in public, thanks to companies like Clearview AI, and I think Yandex in Russia is working on this sort of stuff. Medical diagnosis from scans, again, that could be something where as you get more data, it will get better. Although even there's some exaggeration and there's some concern that that it's still, even in radiology or pathology, the persons are doing routinely better. Speech to text, we all have our frustrations with speech to text, but it's pretty remarkable how it works. And deepfakes. Translation is going to be another area, right? But I could give a whole nother talk about translation, and I hope to at some point next year about how either translation is working or not working as a project of machine learning, particularly in literature. Imperfect but improving are things like spam detection, copyright violation, etc. I do feel like spam is a constant war, and right now I feel like a lot of the programs are on the losing side. I'm getting a lot of spam, but hopefully it's improving over time. Copyright violations. This is one that's quite controversial, but there is, if you look on YouTube or Instagram, there's relatively fast-paced and automated takedowns of things that copyright violate. Automated essay grading, hate speech detection, content recommendation. I should note that, like, with respect to imperfect but improving, I would classify some of these things as actually being more in the fundamentally dubious category. But that's why I want to be in dialogue with Narayan about it. I wanted to give you a sense of what a very leading computer scientist at Princeton thinks and what sort of a lawyer/social theorist like myself thinks. And I do think that automated essay grading, particularly if you look at the work of people like Lucas and Trona on plagiarism detectors, that is a very worrisome way of grading students, and that it sets us up for a world where essentially, rather than essay writing being thought of as self-expression, it becomes sort of a game of adversarial neural networks where students are being encouraged to produce essays that will just get past the machine, right? And that sort of dynamic, again, is something that I deeply worry about, just as I don't think it's really a great idea to have people be looking, continually playing with the hiring video algorithm to figure out how to move their face or what to talk about to get the job. I think that there's something deeply troubling about the automated judgment when you have students running essays by completely black box grading systems and trying to figure out if their sentence length is 10 words or 12 words, if that's going to get them an A or not, right? That is just taking us so far from what a humanistic understanding of writing is that it is deeply troubling. However, I mean, I think it could be a fun game, right? It could be a fun game to play this, and there are games like Capers Please out there, and persuasive games that people like Ian Bogost write about that take on that challenge and that try to gamify more mundane aspects of life. However, I would hate to see these things having a determinative effect on one's future, in part because there's such an alienation from the original coding of those machines. Next, I would also say that, like, in terms of the fundamentally dubious category, predicting recidivism and job success, policing terrorism risk and at-risk kids are things where I think that, like, Narayanan is absolutely right about those. And to suggest, rationales for this, rationales that would come from, my past critiques in Black Back Society, Kathy O'Neill, Virginia Eubanks, many scholars have said that a lot of these systems just build into their system a replication of past prejudices. And so, for example, in predicting job success, Amazon had an algorithm that was continually predicting that men would do better than women. And they ultimately shut this down as a hiring algorithm. And that's, controlling for almost every other thing you can control for. And I think one of the reasons that they did that was because they realized that there was a real problem with respect to it was reflecting a data set based on past hiring practices that were in many ways discriminatory, or a past generalized aspect of hiring that was discriminatory. Okay, so a question, to boil down my concerns about these systems into a slide is, does transparency foster empowerment or modulation of discipline? And if you use this black box hiring algorithm to analyze applicants' faces on video chat, and let's say cover letters to decide whom to interview, it may be impossible to explain how the machine vision behind the system matches the applicants to prototypes of ideal hires, right? There may be 1,000 variables, 10,000 variables. If the variables are interacting, there's no easy way to convey this to people. And an example I would give is, say, someone who smiles a lot in the interview and has a resume where most of the entries are from within 10 years, that person may be, according to the algorithm, the person to hire. But someone who smiles a lot, but most of the entries are from over 10 years ago, maybe someone that they don't hire. And you can add in 1,000 other interactions and other variables to that and just sort of have a system that operates in such a way and is not really explainable, but it just is based on trying to match people to past successes or failures. If you release the system online so the persons can practice what types of expressions, speed of speech, writing, content, etc., leads to higher and lower scores, you could play with the AI much as the person would play chess or go against a software program. All right, should we do this? Well, let me give an example of another system where the stakes are raised. And these are examples from affective computing. And I think these examples from affective computing give a sense of the stakes of this type of gamification of interactions with machines. So imagine that you have a chain of stores that may eventually record its customers for thousands of hours to develop a database of tense situations, people getting frustrated, getting angry, etc. As part of a pivot to automation, it eliminates cashiers in favor of self-service kiosks. Okay, and this is something that happens in many parts of the U.S. You have parts of the U.S. that are struggling, that are sort of areas that scholars have called sacrifice zones. They're just disinvested in. And AI is marketed as a force multiplier there, enabling even leaner staffing. And to deal with the potential for shoplifting, for confrontations, other problems in stores, assaults, even murders, it may use videos of the customers to try to figure out who is a threat and who is not. A subroutine of the program could detect incipient violence and either dispatch an assistant manager to attend to an aggravated customer or an armed security guard to deal with an enraged one. Okay. Now, on the one hand, if we have these type of kiosks out there, one proposal for reform would be to say, let's allow anyone who's going to shop in this store to look at what how their face registers with the computer that is looking for suspicion, right? So if you had an expression that was something like, real anger or something like that, that you would know that this would put the store on notice that a security guard should attend to you. And then you could sort of check out to see how angry can one become in order to avoid having a security guard dispatched. Well, I don't think this is much of a reform, right? I mean, I think this is perhaps in our most minimal sense of reform, it's okay. And perhaps, if we were to apply basic principles of technological due process from Danielle Citron's work to some of these systems, we might say that, like, technologically, it must give notice to people that they could be put under suspicion by acting in a certain way. But I also worry that essentially there's two other dynamics that flow from this, right? And one dynamic is the sense that legitimizing the system by saying, well, everyone was on notice that if they acted in an agitated or angry way around the kiosk, the police would come. And second, that that legitimation dynamic goes hand in hand with the dynamic of people modulating themselves, controlling themselves in order to avoid suspicion, but in ways that I think lead to a form of excessive self-control. But I could be wrong about that, right? I mean, it could be that this is a perspective that is based on an excessively romantic or naturalized theory of emotional life, and that in fact this could be a desirable development, particularly, say, in jurisdictions where people were deemed too emotional, right? I don't particularly go in that direction, but I think that I need to put that on the table as the rationales for those that are exploring some of these systems and exploring particularly the playing with the black box to see exactly how legitimate it. This field of affective computing is a growing one, right? And it's growing in the US in ways that include aggression detectors that record and analyze voices. Those are making inroads into schools. So you have children at schools, and sometimes they'll be playing really aggressively, and then the aggression detector will alert the principal. And in some schools, it directly alerts the police or security guards. So you have that sort of watching or listening, machine listening. And there's some wonderful work being done in Australia on machine listening. And I can't recall the person who wrote it up, but it was an exhibit at a museum at Melbourne University in 2018. There was a great exhibit on how machines listen. Particularly what I found entertaining about that exhibit is that it created a triad between Alexa, Siri, and Google Assistant, where they would each start saying things to each other, and then they would each be talking to each other, the three different AI assistants. And this is kind of fascinating, in terms of seeing how they read each other, to give a clue as to how they might read us. HR departments want to use the AI to parse applicants for nervousness, mood, and behavior patterns, right? So someone who wanted to play with the AI may say, look, I'm nervous, but I want to know, how can I appear not to be nervous in front of the machine? Okay, so that's a way in which one might want to play with the AI. Corporations are investing in affective computing to decode customers. So in the far future, we might imagine a future where when you walk into a mall, you either look like someone who's ready to buy or not. And there, I've found it really interesting to compare experiences at malls around the world. Some malls try to keep people who are only going to buy by not having many places to sit, right? You see this particularly in the PATH station in New York, the train that connects New York and New Jersey, or one of the trains. They developed the station to basically have nowhere to sit. I think there was at least one Hong Kong mall I went to where I had that feeling. I just felt like, well, I better buy some tea because I can't sit anywhere, But there are other ways of doing this, right? Where you could enable a more luxurious setting, but you could do that by using AI to decode, well, who's actually going to buy something at this mall that's going to support our luxurious seating and who's not, right? And consultants have offered insurers facial analysis designed to estimate the real age of applicants. This is, I think, a firm called Lapidus is the company in the US that does this. And they say things like, we all know when you come to a college reunion or high school reunion and see people after 20 or 25 years, some people look like they've aged 40 years and some people look like they've aged 10 years, like they barely changed at all. And their idea behind their software is that this is a reference to, or this is a clue to who will live longer or not live as long. It makes some common sense, although it may also just be a good indicator of who has the best plastic surgeon. So I don't know, but I think this is something where, again, that sort of facial analysis is something where people may want to be figuring out, if I put on certain makeup, does my picture get analyzed by the life insurer in a more positive or negative way? I think that this is a problem, though, and I think all of these are problems, and I developed this critique out of the old story of Tom Sawyer from Mark Twain. Essentially, a lot of the affective computing say, well, if you don't like these systems, work with us to make it better. Work with us to either to improve the accuracy of our systems, right? But my problem with that is that, like just in the old Mark Twain story, where Tom Sawyer told all of his friends, "Oh, I love painting this fence. Wouldn't you like to paint the fence too?" It sort of is like this way of inviting people in to do the work that ought to be done by the affective computing companies themselves. And I think particularly as minoritized groups are invited to participate in developing more fair and transparent emotion analyzers, some of the worst abuses of crime predicting and hiring software can be preempted. But should we aim to fix these systems, or is there a deeper critique of them? Well, I'm going to give you the deeper critique. I have, in past work, I've given the reason why we want to bring in civil society and other groups to improve the systems. But I also think that there's a deeper critique where we may not want these systems to be existing at all, and that the the invitation to play with them, to invest in learning them, is, rather than being a good invitation to improve them, is in fact leading us down the wrong path. Why do I say that? Well, I think that there are, particularly in thinking about the emotions and the interface of emotions and machines, there are sometimes crude theories of emotional life, right? And I'm actually working on a piece now on emotion recognition technology, and it's how it fits with various aesthetic and philosophical theories of emotion. And on the left side of the slide, I have just images from this Pixar film called Inside Out, which kind of theorized the emotions as homunculi, as sort of small people within our brains that are sort of either one or another is pushy on a particular day. I think that this sort of position aligns with a lot of popular understanding of emotion, and with, say, people like Marvin Minsky might deal with that to say we can scientize this, right? The question that Minsky raises in The Emotion Machine is, how do we manage to think at all? We've done, and his position is that we've done very little work to really understand this on a scientific level, but contrast this with the progress that we've seen toward answering questions about physical things. What are solids, liquids, and gases? What are color, sounds, and temperatures? How do you measure them, right? And I think that the problem with this analogy is that in the case of solids, liquids, and gases, and sort of things in the world, we do have a common social aspiration to control them in certain ways, and to use them for our purposes. But I think with persons, the idea of controlling, managing, predicting emotional responses, or things that people talk about, things that people think about, that's a far more controversial goal. And to sort of leverage the ability of any authority, be it governmental or corporate, to do that via computing, always has to be looked at with a certain degree of suspicion. Right? And I think that this is sort of the dark side of effective computing. The light side is certainly told in a book like Girl Decoded by Ron Al-Kalioubi, who is a co-founder, I believe, of the firm Affectiva, along with Rosalind Picard at MIT. But if you look at some of the patent applications of a firm like that, one of the applications involved how quantification might work by analyzing faces to capture emotional responses and to generate an engagement score. So in the future, for talks like this, there may be a opportunity or requirement for all the participants' faces to be on camera, and then the speaker is given an engagement score, right? Or workers at a store, at the cafe that I mentioned earlier, there may be facial recognition on all the customers, and with the idea that did the customer like what the cafe worker is doing. And so we might eventually supplement the idea of a cash tip with a reputational tip, which would be like a big smile after getting one's coffee. Again, though, I think that the pressure to perform in this way threatens to undermine the spontaneity, expressiveness, and autonomy that makes the underlying emotional expression something valuable in our world, right? And this is this reminds me of the old idea of just trying to killing a butterfly by trying to catch it, right? If you try to essentially maximize the utilization of analysis of people's expression and their faces and other things about them, what they talk about, etc., then you run into the problem of Campbell's law, which is that as soon as a mode of evaluating outcomes becomes quantified and well-known, it starts to erode as a quality measure of those outcomes because people try to game the system, right? Or there's social pressure to game the system. And that I think is a deeply troubling aspect of it, sort of somewhat paradoxical, right? Because in some level you might say, well, once we do this, we're actually improving and promoting people's ability to express themselves and rewarding them for it. But on the other hand, that the very act of quantifying, recording this interactions is what can lead to a feeling of a lack of authenticity and a lack of true reflection of what one is feeling, until, of course, one just completely, the mask becomes face and one's expressions to maximize reputation become part of oneself. That could be the goal, who knows. For the most extreme example of how this could work, this is a patent application, or how this sort of like control of one's behavior could work. This is from a patent application for a screen that watches the watcher. So this television screen, someone's watching a police show or something like that. They're watching this crime scene. And then there are advertisements. And the idea behind this is that the firm wants to be able to verify that you've watched the advertisement. So now we're trained to click on YouTube, or I don't know how this works in other platforms. I should explore how it works with video platforms in China and elsewhere. But at least what I've experienced with YouTube is that if you want to get to the underlying video, you click on the button that says, after 5 seconds, skip ad, right? Well, imagine a world where you need to do a bit more. You have to jump up and shout McDonald's when seeing a hamburger, and then the ad ends, and then you get to watch your show again. This may well be something quite efficient, and it may be great to get couch potatoes off of the couch and exercising and active. But I think a lot of people bridle at that as a possible level of granular control and stimulus of individuals, right? That we may not want to see a world where we're manipulated in that way. The root of the problem, I think, is naturalism and social science. And this goes back to people like Charles Taylor and Hubert Dreyfus. And certainly I've drawn deeply on their work in my own work. But I think what's the people that are now carrying on that tradition include, very interestingly, Mark Bevere and Jason Blakely in this book called Interpretive Social Science: An Anti-Naturalist Approach. And what their fundamental argument is that the power and prestige of science arises out of the ability it grants us to manipulate and control the natural world. We should be very cautious about any psychological or social science or black boxes that reduce the human to one more resource to be fully understood, controlled, and manipulated. To return to our theme of playing the machine, who's playing whom, right? We may confront the machine trying to obtain a higher score, but the machine's objective might be framed as an effort to get the human to make the expressions or write in the style it most highly values. Now, this might remind you of actor network theory, of sort of theories of agency in objects in the world. The classic sort of cartoon version of this is, did people domesticate grass and wheat, or did wheat domesticate people, right? That's sort of a question. And I think that while this question of characterization might seem like a mere trick of words, with respect to the machines I've been talking about, it's not, because there are people with commercial interests directly behind the machines. I think it's kind of silly to think of the grass or dogs having some agenda in domesticating their owners or domesticating agricultural laborers for thousands of years, right? But I think that with respect to the machines I've just talked about, they're all mediating between corporations largely, with managers, with certain goals that are trying to achieve certain ends. And I think that, the problem there suggests the normative principles, where to avoid alienation, and that means a sense of meaninglessness and powerlessness for me, that will depend first on an empathetic, moral, and even aesthetic understanding of how persons experience their encounters with AI. I'll very quickly mention, this was a school that was reported in the Chinese English language media, Sixth Tone, as a class care system, where essentially a deep learning algorithm would look at the faces of each student in the class, report on their engagement, give them a score, and then that could be used to score the teacher and to alert parents of, say, the student who has a red box, right? All the students with green boxes are paying attention. The student with a red box is not paying enough attention at that time, right? But you can see that, like on Weibo and on other social media, I think there was a hashtag that said after this, "Thank God I graduated already," right? Where people were resisting it. There was resistance to say, like, this seems like a really invasive sort of a system. On the other hand, lots of parents liked it. Lots of parents said, if I am to maximize the performance of my child, I want to be sure of this. But there are other policy trends that I think, for example, in the recent ban on certain or nonprofit conversion for lots of ed tech, may say that authorities are feeling like look, we need people to have a bit more play in the joints, about the ability to not be constantly trying to work, etc. So, I don't know exactly how this frame turns out, but I think this is another example of how dialogue about the subjective experience of having a picture of one's face taken each second or every 5 seconds and analyzed for a score will help us to understand more about what should be going on in these scenarios, and especially how to avoid feeling like one is being played by the black box. I also think that we still need to keep in mind the classic critiques, which are that there are problems even of accuracy here, and that people express different emotions in different ways. The answer here, I think, is not necessarily either to get everyone trained to have the same face to indicate that they are paying attention, nor is it an effort to burrow more and more deeply and say, for example, supplement the picture of the face with a galvanic skin response device that could also be placed on the students in that scenario. It is rather to develop the type of explainable systems with human mediation that get people to authentically buy into the situation, as opposed to trying to play the machine to appear to have been successful or to appear to be engaged. This is part of the theory of algorithmic accountability that I have put forward in the Law and Political Economy blog and other places, saying that there has to be both a first, a second, and a third wave of algorithmic accountability, and that fundamentally some of these systems are so invasive that a ban is appropriate. We don't want to just try to play with the systems. We may well try to ban them. I see that I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to, I think, go through these other case studies, but I will come back to them about how this vision that I'm articulating could apply in areas like law, medicine, even the measurement of macroeconomic aggregates like inflation. I'll also just very quickly say that my goal here is a peaceable kingdom where AI and the professions maintain their distinctiveness, so we have roles for professionals in evaluating these systems, that we don't just sort of create these systems to themselves evaluate professionals, and that the power only goes one way. And my bottom lines here are that it's time for a new political economy of automation, in part because many spheres are too important to be dominated by the logic of the video game. Rather than telling people that, hey, let's learn how to hack these systems, let's learn how to have the perfect face for the classroom monitors or the hiring algorithm or what have you. Rather, let's try to co-govern these systems, and let's try to have some level of personal involvement and understanding of what is going on. Okay? So with that, I really look forward to the conversation afterward, questions, etc. Of course, if there aren't questions, or if there's other, I can go back to some of those two earlier slides, because I'm very happy to elaborate on those. But I think I'll stop my share for now and put it up. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pasquale. That was a really good talk. Really appreciate it. I mean, there's a lot of material here that gives us a lot to think about. Let me ask all participants who wish to engage with the speaker to please write up questions using the chat box. So please write up any questions you have, and I will communicate the questions to the speaker. Or if you'd like to ask yourself, just simply write down, I'd like to ask a question, and that would be probably better, but it is up to you. Let me remind everyone again of something I said in the beginning, that this discussion is being recorded. So if you don't wish to be recorded, you can just type up your questions in the chat box, and I will communicate them. So please think about it and send questions. One of the ideas that I found really exciting in the talk is that a lot of affective computing is problematic, not because it is somehow unfair and discriminatory, although it is, and these things are problematic, as if we could bring in people belonging to discriminated against groups, and they could participate in the development of these systems, and then that would make it all better. But rather that fundamentally these systems are problematic because they introduce an element of, say, calculation into behavior, so that people begin to play for the machine and model their own behavior in line with what they think the machine expects. And that creates a fundamental distortion of our emotional life, right? That because we begin to put on a mask, so to speak, and eventually might lead to a situation where the mask becomes the face. Right. And we rearrange our entire emotional life based on a calculus that we have learned to internalize. This is a kind of interesting. So I take it that what you're saying is, instead of trying to get people involved into the development of these systems, we should simply question the systems and maybe even ban them altogether.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, to go back to the hiring example at the beginning, that's an example where I think that there are roles. I mean, I think that there's other ways you could hire, for example. So like the US Post Office for many years had an exam, right? Or there are exams for hiring. There are other systems where you could be asked to perform in a certain way so that your performance met certain criteria. So for example, in the New York Times recently, they just reported on TikTok resumes. So young people are doing TikToks, recording TikToks to say, here's why I want the job, right? And so the idea there is that at least there's, and the question then becomes, having a person judge it, having a machine judge it, I perhaps at that point would be indifferent between a person and machine judging it, at least with respect to the idea that it's judging it on the nature of, is there what's going on in the video that might be, say, and if it was articulable. But I think we're far away from having a machine able to articulate why the performance itself would have been optimal, or would sort of show great promise with respect to employability. But I think overall, like I've been in dialogue with people who are now writing to or working with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the US, right? And the idea behind them is that, like, a lot of them they only see the bias concern. And don't get me wrong, the bias concern is massive and important. But I also think that, like, the alienation concern is critical. And perhaps the problem is, perhaps the problem is even more structural. I mean, why are there firms that are hiring thousands of people or like getting thousands of applications or something like that? But on top of that, I think that there's a question of the ability for an institution to have human governance and contributions to how it's run on many levels. And I worry about a world where it's just, there's this one algorithm, and particularly because it can shut people out, right? There's a story in Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neill about a person who had a certain mental illness, and he would be taking these algorithmic tests to get a job. This was before the era of the video. This was just sort of tests where they would ask questions like, how do you feel when this thing occurs or something? And when something occurs, so let's say, how do you feel when there's a new challenge at work? And the applicant had certain mental illness like depression, where I think most of his responses were pretty negative. And he was basically shut out of work. And I think that there are problems there in that, like, he wasn't really, for many of the jobs, going to have to interact with people at all. So his subjective experience didn't really matter that much. He did perhaps, it might be a little difficult for the supervisor to deal with him. But on the other hand, it's discriminatory on some, because what was being encoded in there was essentially a bias against people with a certain mental illness. And secondly, because the algorithms were used so often and in so many ways, that person was shut out. So in a prior system where you might have, say, a distribution of hundreds or thousands of hiring managers, you'd think eventually there might be someone that would give him a chance or be more simpatico. But as these systems become more monopolistic, and as they're used over thousands and thousands of cases, then you have the problem of certain people just being shut out entirely. I think that problem of being shut out is really important because it reminds me of dynamics in tech, where the promise of the tech is not necessarily that we have figured out a way to hire the best people, and we have a theory of that, but rather the big data mindset is we have the most data. So we have data on 50,000 past employees, and we can match anyone against 50,000 past employees. But the problem is it's very hard to develop a rival system, because who else is going to have data on that many employees, right, in particular situations? And so that's where, even though in the abstract, the question of whether I get to see a person when I applied for a job or am simply evaluated by a machine, in the abstract, that might seem like 6 of one, half dozen of another. It's not that big a difference. But thinking about the larger political economic dynamics here, that's where the danger starts occurring, because of this problem of being shut out, the problem of sort of systems that are replaying the past into the future, not necessarily having a logic as to why the past was better, but just replaying it into the future. And the problem of sort of a lack of understanding of anyone as to how this machine is operating. And the other final example I'll just give is that there's lots of exposés recently about search engines and social networks and the type of content they are amplifying. And I don't think anyone would have chosen at these firms to, for example, amplify really dangerous or dangerous content, or to fan the flames of genocide in countries like Myanmar, or cause violence in Mexico, or the many places where these algorithms have caused many bad outcomes. But because the system has sort of drifted away from being understandable by any particular persons who could assert control, all these bad outcomes come out of it, and yet there's no way of really trying to direct it. And my final point would be, I'm sorry, I promised a final point, but I'll make one more because I feel a little bit on a roll here, is that this goes back to a talk I gave actually for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Germany, where I talked about the way in which algorithmic systems and markets are treated as natural processes that can't be controlled. So and I think that the idea that you should play with it to understand it, that's a bit like saying, well, we're going to experiment with the natural world and eventually control it. Or we're going to, in a video game, I'll play 500 times and eventually I'll beat the video game. But the problem with these systems is that they are constantly changing. And so, like nature itself, we can discover laws of nature. We can't discover laws of the search engine. We can know certain laws, but certain regularities, but we can't discover laws of it because it may be entirely changed the next week. So the very premise on which we base the ability or the merit of trying to experiment and play with a system in order to gain knowledge of it and to manipulate it, that very ideal is not really possible with respect to the systems we're talking about today. It's among cheerleaders, like in Ready Player One, the book and the movie. They portray a metaverse that is something like a natural world that you could play with and eventually master and figure out. But I think in our world, as soon as someone finds out, they're going to get kicked out, right? If they're too successful, they're going to be kicked out, or the system will change. It'll be deemed gaming. And so there again, I think is a fundamental difference where we really need to question the value of like playing with the black box.
Thank you. There's a lot to discuss here, but there's another question that's coming via the chat from Linda Lai. Linda, would you like to?
Hi, sure. Thank you, Frank. This is very enlightening, and I really like the many distinctions you have made. After a lot of initial exposure to the discussion from the critical side, there's always, a lot of grand generalization. I really appreciate you coming in to make a lot of my smaller, finer distinction to help. My question may perhaps have been partially addressed by you already, but perhaps it's also very big and broad. that it comes from a helpless individual in society who feels she is standing in front of a gigantic machine so complex that I'm not able to make sense of. So I am very attracted by your last slide in which you mentioned co-governance rather than hacking. Yes, but this word also immediately, so for me, it associates with having conversations with lawyers, having discussion with them, and having their servers, which is actually happening, somehow in some of the context that I found myself. So the question is there something that an individual should start to become more aware of in terms of working with lawyers, or how else could co-governance happen when this is not prescribed in your own social structure?
Yes, yes. No, it's a great question. And I think that this idea of how to bring in a number of different forms of expertise, bringing in the legal expertise, the social science expertise, to bring in artistic perspectives as well, is really important to understand these black boxes. And I think with respect to the lawyering, it's so interesting to look at how I think in Europe, China, and the US are all converging toward a sense that there needs to be some accountability by the large tech firms that run the black boxes, and that there needs to be some elementary level of transparency. The European AI Act is really helpful on this front in prescribing audits, in prescribing standardization bodies that the entities have to report to. In the US, there's a lot of interest at the Federal Trade Commission to try to understand algorithms and to give people some basic demands. And I just saw very recently the draft Chinese internet regulations had certain provisions for requiring algorithmic disclosures, or for giving people a chance to know exactly how the recommendation systems are working within media. And so I think in all of those areas, it's going to be a real struggle. But there's and the other thing that I think is helpful here is you'll often hear from the firms running the black boxes, well, we can't tell you what we're doing because there's a trade secret. If we give you the trade secret, that's the whole value of our company. But I think what we're learning is, like, there are lots of ways around that. There are always, for example, like describing the data going in at some level of generalization. You don't have to give people the exact data set that says identified with people and all the rest. You can say, well, we base this on information about workers from a certain company, from a certain date, etc. And just having that knowledge allows you to know, well, it's certainly, maybe it's valuable in analyzing them, but it doesn't necessarily have value analyzing me. So those sort of, and I think there's a piece by Timnit Gebru called Data Sheets for Data Sets, which talks about the type of data sheets and disclosure that should be made for each of these data sets that are used in these systems. So those are the sorts of things where I think that that initial effort could really be valuable. Freedom of Information Act requests, other act requests. Oh, and the other thing that I think is valuable is for government, when government contracts with firms, the procurement contracts having certain basic provisions for transparency and for understanding it. And that is something that I've seen out of the AI Now Institutes. They did a shadow report that was in the wake of New York City's Algorithmic Accountability Report. And New York City did a really terrible job. Unfortunately, I feel bad criticizing my own city, but they did not do a very good job. But then the AI Now Institute at New York University wrote what it said the report should have been, and that was much more enlightening. So, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Okay. If anybody else has questions, please don't forget you can type the question, or just let me know that there is a question. I have a couple of more questions. One of them is also about your last slide, or one of the last slides. You mentioned that it's time for a new political economy of automation. Would you maybe elaborate a bit on that idea?
Yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but this is one where I am part of a group. We're not quite a collective, but we're a group called the Law and Political Economy association. So there's scholars from around the country. We've got a blog that is hosted by Yale Law School and a journal called the Journal of Law and Political Economy. And our fundamental commitment is to say that the economy as it exists is not fixed, that there always is room for state intervention and for public participation to promote public values. So the thing that we've mainly focused on is questions like global warming, trying to green the economy. But I think that this sort of industrial policy to green the economy, there could be a whole parallel realm in the cybersphere, in the sphere of AI, that can be about trying to direct AI research toward the most socially valuable ends. And in my book, New Laws of Robotics, I say that like those socially valuable ends include trying to bring up the living standards of people generally around the world, but they don't include efforts to stigmatize, rank, and rate individuals. My worry is that we have so much AI research that, and there's so much data about people, and that since AI research is based on data, the researchers are migrating toward how do we sort of understand, control, manipulate people. And I think that like a lot of that research would be much better directed toward industrial policy of using the same sort of mathematical skills and data collection, et cetera, to figure out how do we optimally develop building cooling systems. And Google uses this as an example of their AI, that they've figured out how to keep servers within the right range of temperatures, right? And so I'd much rather see AI development that's about how do we optimize the temperature of servers to minimize the use of fossil fuels, then I would like to see AI research about how do we ensure that every student in a classroom is looking at the teacher's face 98% of the time, right? And I feel like, so unfortunately, there's sometimes just so much effort on the latter area because it's low-hanging fruit, and that's where I think that the inclusive political economy of automation comes in. The other side of it that I would say is like really important about political economy concerns is to see the market as something that can be where there can be intervention in the market, and to see that there's always been intervention in the market. So it's not like we had a market that was free of state intervention and then the state intervenes. Merely by having a market, the state has to enforce rules of contracts and torts. And so when you look at things in that way, there's always been intervention. And so therefore the state sort of adding in certain rules doesn't necessarily add to that. It in fact, or it just is a different version of it. So yeah.
Okay, so you see then this kind of political economy as somewhat like in the line of Karl Polanyi and the Great Transformation, those kinds of discussions regarding the value of state intervention.
I do, and what I should also say is I've just spent a lot of time on state intervention, and Polanyi is a great connection as well. State intervention for what? Well, I think the state intervention first has to be to preserve a livable planet. Second, the state intervention has to be sort of preserving, improving living standards. But third, and equally important, I shouldn't really have numbered them, but equally important is to provide a job to all, right? A job guarantee. In that sense, to provide for the state to take on responsibility to say, for anyone that wants a job, we're going to provide that sense of purpose and meaning and connection to the society. And I think that is, and that's particularly important in automation because rather than seeing automation as putting humans out of work, I see it as creating infinite work, right? I think that the problem is less one of, oh, wow, the robots are going to take all our jobs, than now that we have lots of robots around and lots of AI around, there are millions of new jobs in cybersecurity, in understanding how these systems work together, in promoting, say, forms of automated driving and then building those into better public transit systems. Those are just the tip of the iceberg of the jobs to be done. And so, it's just so strange. And I wish I had hit this a little bit harder in my book. I was being very moderate and careful with the book, but I think it's my position now is that really we've got an infinite work problem, and part of the solution to the infinite work problem is to sort of structure and parcel it out in ways that are sort of maximizing social benefit. And that's a really important role for state actors to take on.
And I think there's also a kind of maybe implicit theme running through the talk, which is the importance of preserving the autonomy of humanistic understanding. The humanities as a place where discussions about value can unfold, and the importance of preserving it from the pressures towards formalization, quantification, and so on.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. And I think that that's particularly comes out in my conception of emotional life, right? Because I think that if you consider ways of thinking about human psychology and emotion, there have been theories of behaviorism that say that essentially all that matters is stimulus and response, and we see input comes in, output goes out. And of course, that's the definition of a black box as well, right? And they sort of model the human mind as a black box, that there simply are stimulus and responses. But if you look into literature, if you look at the literature of people like of Henry James, of Proust, I am woefully ignorant of Chinese literature, but I know that there are there are amazing poets, and other literary figures around the world who have done enormous work and great work in articulating emotional states, articulating them in all their complexity, in all their strangeness, in all of their and thinking about how they relate to values. And there's always going to be a need for that, I think, in a society that is committed to both holding on to and maintaining a set of values and refining and developing them over time, right? And so that I think is really important. Like when I see on Facebook 6 reaction buttons to a statement, right, and say that someone posts on Facebook that they've had a divorce, they've left their husband or wife or something, those lines, and we're being asked to either say smile, celebrate, sad face, or happy face, or angry face. This to me is really worrisome, right? I mean, if you think of the expression of emotion in literature, like someone like Henry James, there are probably an infinite variety of permutations about how one could respond to that development, right? And in any sort of contemporary novelist, people like Rachel Cusk, Ian McEwan, Hari Kunzru, etc., the beauty and value of this literature is that you're seeing, and of art as well, is that you're seeing in literature the incredible diversity of responses one could have to any given situation. I was recently at a show of the paintings of the early Alice Neal, and I was just amazed at the depths of emotional expression she could register with a very simple style. At that time, she was painting in a very simple style in the 30s and 40s. And this to me is what we risk sort of paving over or rendering inconsequential to the extent we take on Minsky's position and see emotional life as simply something to be maximized, controlled, measured, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, the value of humanities is very important, and I hit that very hard both in chapters 3 and 7 of New Laws of Robotics. Yeah.
So there's a question coming in from the audience. Maybe I'll read the question. I don't know whether this person wants to speak. No, maybe not. Okay. Do you think that there are do you think that there exist maybe better forms of affective computing applications, or do you think that the very idea of quantifying human emotions or behavior is fundamentally problematic and it should be jettisoned altogether? Yes.
I think that there are some therapeutic interventions, particularly for autistic children, that show some promise. So I think that there are some, very interesting developments in affective computing that are grounded there that I think are useful. I think that in general, though, I really worry about it because I'm always worried about the second step. The first step being there's going to be, let's say that we develop affective computing to see what shows on television or what videos that you watch you're most engaged by. And you don't have to go to the problem of rating them 1 to 10, you'll just look at your face and sit to see what were you really looking at the whole time. I still think that even if that can lead to a world where we get more content that engages us, that we like, still, I don't necessarily think of that as a great development, because I think that there's the problem at the steps of 2, 3, 4, 5. What we see these systems is there are people that game them. So you might have a very determined minority of people who are going to look at particular content and always look at it with like really rapt attention. Like they're really like, wow, this is fantastic, etc. And I imagine that a lot of that content could be very bad content, right? When I look at the type of things that get to the top of the YouTube algorithm in the US, there is a ton of right-wing extremism, of misogynistic content, of anti-diversity content, etc. And that's because, the people that thought hardest and really wanted to get their stuff to the top of the feed were the ones who invested the most time in manipulating it, and also paid YouTube or paid for placement as well. I think there were similar dynamics on Google with respect to certain sites that people were trying to visit for opioid addiction treatments, that you had people that were bad actors that pushed the worst sites to the top. And what's really fascinating here is that with respect to these addiction clinics, end with for-profit education in the US, what happens is there are companies that don't pay teachers or don't pay their clinicians very much. They have a skeletal crew. They put all their money into marketing online. And then guess what? When you search for college or you search for addiction treatment in the US, the entities that pay the least for actually teaching or helping people and pay the most for marketing are the people that end up on top. And this to me is just something that, like, given the failures of these mass systems in so many instances, I feel like before I'd be willing to endorse affective computing as a mode for helping us understand who's speaking well, what programs are interesting, what person should be hired, etc., I'd want to see a really good account of how well that gaming problem could be addressed. Because I think otherwise we're just in a world of trouble.
Thank you. Do you think that maybe there is something deeply rooted in modern Western culture, of which the problems of affective computing partake? I mean, I'm thinking of a tendency that goes back maybe to Descartes, who wrote a book about the passions of the soul, where he attempted to apply a kind of analytical method to the emotions and break them down into basic components. And then these ideas were taken up by Charles Le Brun, who was a painter, and he used those same techniques to help painters portray emotions effectively. Then Charles Darwin used a similar approach. Whether there's something about a kind of Western analytical culture that we need to reflect upon.
Yes, I think that this is true. I mean, I think that the philosopher that's influenced me most, Charles Taylor, begins one of his leading collections with an essay called, or at the top of near the top of the collection is an essay called "Overcoming Epistemology," and the idea there is that this sense that you could have a mind discrete from the body and discrete from its instantiation in the flesh, to quote Lakoff and Johnson's book Philosophy in the Flesh, that could be entirely distinct from and separate from its particularized embodiment, right? And this is something that I think is really, like, a lot of thinkers are playing with this idea now. I mean, I'm giving a talk in a couple days for the We Robot conference. And one of my arguments is that robots should not have rights because they don't have minds, they don't have soul, they don't have the sort of like the ability. And to the extent they do have a mind, you could always program it differently. So if a robot says, I want to speak, well, you just program that to say that they wouldn't want to speak, right? Whereas with humans, you really couldn't do that, or it'd be an extremely painful and brutal process. With a robot, it's simply you change maybe 100 lines of code or whatever it might be, you turn that off, or however many lines of codes it takes, but you just do it. And so I think that this comes, but the robot rights people, those who are advocating for this position, they tend to say that mind is substrate independent. that mind can be, that you could instantiate a mind, run a mind like software on any hardware. You could run it on a computer, in a human body, perhaps with an adequately connected brain, a duck, who knows? You can run all these things on different substrates. And I think that the roots of that are in that sort of Cartesian dualism, or in a Cartesian sort of approach toward sort of seeing the mind as being so distinctive from the brain, or from one's embodiment. And so therefore, I think that you're right to say that there are some blind spots there. And I think that some of the philosophical traditions that are capable of recognizing those blind spots are comparatively neglected and need to be engaged with more.
I think there was a slide, I think I remember, where you referred to Dreyfus and Rabinow, I think.
Yes, yeah.
So there is a kind of suggestion of Heidegger's critique of the whole Cartesian tradition. And I think it would be interesting if we could bring in those kinds of philosophical issues into the computer science curriculum.
I agree completely. Yeah, I do. I mean, and I try to in the last chapter of New Laws of Robotics, I draw on Wittgenstein to sort of make a case for, bringing in this sort of like more continental perspective, getting away from the analytic perspective, which I think drives, I think most of economics and engineering are driven by utilitarianism and analytic sort of approaches. And I think that the question then becomes, how do the humanities and law and policy sciences bring in their own methodologies, metaphysics, and even ontologies, right? What we think are fundamentally true or fundamentally real about the universe. How do we bring those in and broker a good conversation? But you're right. I mean, I nearly took a job as a professor of law and computer science, and part of my job would have been to bring that to computer scientists. But I also felt like that's a lot of work, and I didn't know if I could continue doing my own research if I had to try to translate that for a computer science audience. So yeah.
Well, but in a way, something you said points the way towards a potential solution. You mentioned that a lot of economics and computer science is based on utilitarian assumptions. So I think the first step should be to tell scholars in those areas that their work is not independent of philosophy, but that it's covertly philosophical. It's just that there are philosophical assumptions that are not acknowledged. And maybe we should acknowledge them and consider alternatives.
I really like that point of view. Yes, yes. And I think that is the biggest problem. And it's a problem for law as well. And this is one reason why there's so much enthusiasm about automation of law, is because there are those that view law simply as a branch of engineering. And they think, well, law is about helping people plan, and you're just helping plan a society, and it's about solving the technical problem of social control, and that's it. And that's not true. I mean, and certainly if one takes that position, one has taken a relatively controversial position, I think, about the jurisprudence, about the nature of authority, about the nature of about any number of issues. And so I think that you're exactly right to say that everyone has an underlying philosophy and approach. It's just how well is it articulated and acknowledged.
Thank you. Well, I think time is now up. I'd like to first of all say thank you to our speaker, to Professor Frank Pasquale, for an outstanding presentation. Really, we really appreciate this, and I'm sure we have all learned a lot from this. So really, we are very grateful. I'd also like to remind everyone who's here, in case some people came a little bit late, I'd like to remind you that we are going to upload a recording of this talk. So keep in touch and keep following the Writing Machine collective newsletter, and we will let everybody know when this is uploaded, and you can review the whole presentation. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for being here, for your participation. And this is the last talk, but keep on following the Writing Machine, and we will be developing a series of annotations, which will be discussion seminars revolving around the themes raised by the various speakers. Thank you, everybody, and have a good morning or good evening, or depending on where in the world you are.
Yes. Good morning, good evening, and thanks so much. It's been wonderful to be here. Thank you.